Chapter 16 of South Sea Idyls by Charles Warren Stoddard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16 Love Life in A Lanai. It was the witching hour of sunset, and we sat at dinner with tearful eyes over the Commodore's curry. You see, the Commodore prided himself on the strength of this identical dish, and kept a mahogany-tinted East Indian steward for the sole sake of his skill in concocting the same. We dined, as usual, in the Commodore's unrivalled lanai, the very thought of which is a kind of spiritual feast to this hour. And while we sat at his board, we heard for the 20th time the monotonous recital of his adventures by flood and field. Like most sea stories, his narratives were ever fresh, as though they had been stowed away in brine, were fished out of the vasty deep expressly for the occasion, and put to soak again in their natural element as soon as we had tasted their quality. The Commodore was a roaring old sea-dog, who had been cast ashore somewhere in the early part of the century, and finding himself in quarters more comfortable than his wildest fancy dared to paint, he resolved to end his amphibious days on that strip of shining beach, and never more lose sight of land until he should slip his cable for the last time, and sail into undiscovered seas. Meanwhile, he entertained his friends at Waikiki, a kind of tropical Long Beach, a few miles out of Honolulu, and the grace with which he introduced Jack ashore to the dreamy twilight of his lanai is one of Jack's deathless memories. We met the Commodore in the interesting character of Jack ashore, and with uncovered heads and hearts full of emotion entered the lanai. And now for a word to the uninitiated concerning the lanai in question. Off there in the Pacific, under the vertical sun, all shadow is held at a premium. There are stationary caravans of cocoa trees that seem to be looking for their desert home, weird, slender trees with tattered plumes, and a hopeless air about them, as though they were born to sorrow, but meant to make the best of it. Still, these fine old palms cast a thin shadow, about the size and shape of a colossal spider, and there is no comfort in trying to sit in it. Of course, there are other trees with more foliage, and vines that run riot and blossom themselves to death. But somehow the sharp arrows of sunshine dart in and sting a fellow in an unpleasant fashion, and nothing short of a good thatch is to be relied upon. So out from the low eaves of the Commodore's cottage, on the seaward side, there was a dense roof of leaves and grass that ran clear to the edge of the sea, and looked as though it wanted to go farther. But the Commodore knew it was useless to attempt to roof over that institution. There was a leafy tapestry hanging 2 feet below the roof on the 3 sides thereof, and from the floor of the enclosure rose a sort of trellis of woven rushes that hedged us in to the waist. There was a wicker gate and an open space between the leafy stalactite and stalagmite barricade for ventilation and view, and everywhere there was a kind of semi-twilight that seemed crammed full of dreams and delicious indolence, and this is the Hawaiian lanai. Of course, the Commodore always dined in his lanai. It was like taking curry on the quarter-deck of the what-do-you-call-her, in the dead calm of the Indian seas. And when that mahogany steward entered with turban and mock turtle (he always looked to me like a full-blooded snake-charmer), I had the greatest difficulty in restraining myself, for it seemed to me incredible that any Jack ashore could dine in a lanai with His Excellency, and not rise between each savory course to make a dozen profound salaams to the fattish gentleman at the head of the table, who was literally covered with invisible navel buttons, and the hallucination increased as the dinner courses multiplied. At this stage, just as the snake-charmer was entering with something that seemed to have come to an untimely end in wine-sauce, At this stage the Commodore turned to us, as though he were about to give some order that we might disregard at the peril of our lives. These sea dogs never quite outgrow that sort of thing. "Gentlemen," said he, casting a watchful and suspicious eye over the weather bow, "there is to be a luau, a native feast, in the adjoining premises. Will you do me the honour to accompany me thither after we have lighted our cigars?" I forget what answer we made, but then dinner was well on toward dessert, and our answer was immaterial. We had our orders, couched in courteous language, and we were thankful for this consideration. Moreover, we were wild to see a native feast. There is a peculiar charm in obeying our superiors, when we happen, by some dispensation of divine providence, to be exactly of the same mind. Black coffee was offered us, in cups of the pattern of gulls' eggs. By this time all the sky was saffron, all the sea a shadow of saffron, and in the golden haze that lay between, a schooner with a piratical slant to her masts swam by, beyond the foam that hissed along the reef. It was a wonderful picture, but it came in between the courses of the Commodore's dinner, as though it were nothing better than a panel painting in the after cabin of the What-d'ye-call-her. However, as she swung in toward the mouth of the harbor, and passed a bottle of Burgundy in safety, but seemed in imminent danger of missing stays abreast of an enormous pyramid of fruit, from the Commodore's point of sight, you know, the old gentleman lost his temper, and gave an order in such peremptory terms that I cheerfully refrained from reproducing it on this occasion. To cover our confusion, we immediately adjourned to the native feast. Hawaiian feast days are not set down in the calendar. Somebody's child has a birthday, or there is a new house that needs christening, or perhaps a church is in want, and the feast can net $100 or $2 for it. Since all the eatables in such cases are donated, and the eaters enter to the feast with a payment of $1 per head, our feast was not sanctified. A chief of the best blood was in the humour to entertain his friends, countrymen, and lovers. We belonged to the first order, or rather the Commodore was his friend, and we speedily became as friendly as possible. As we entered the premises, it appeared to us that half the island was under cover, for limitless lanais seemed to run on to the end of time in bewitching vistas. Numberless lanterns swung softly in the evening gale. A multitude of white-robed native girls passed to and fro, with that inimitable grace which I have always supposed Eve copied from the serpent and imparted to her daughters, who still affect the modern Edens of the earth. Young Hawaiian bloods, clad in snow-white trousers and ballet shirts, with wreaths of mailne around their necks, and ginger flowers in their hair, grouped themselves along the evergreen corridors, and looked unutterable things without any noticeable effort on their part. Through the central corridor, under a long line of lanterns, was spread the corporeal feast, and on either side of it, in two ravenous lines, sat, tailor fashion, the hungry and the thirsty. It is useless to attempt an idealization of the Hawaiian eater. He simply devours whatever suits his palate, as though he were a packing case that needed filling, and the sooner filled the more creditable the performance. But the amount of filling that he is equal to is the marvel, and the patient perseverance of the man, so long as there is a crumb left, is something that I despair of reconciling with any known system of physiology. The mastication began early in the afternoon. It was 8 p.m. when we looked in upon the orgy, and the bones were not all picked, though they seemed likely to be before midnight. "Will you eat?" said the host. It was not etiquette to decline, and we sat at the end of the lanai, with nameless dishes strewn about us in hopeless confusion. We dipped a finger into pink poi, and took a pinch of baked dog. We had limpets with rock salt. kukuya nuts, roasted and pulverized, and the pale, quivering bits of fish flesh, not an hour dead, and still cool with the native coolness of the sea. It was a fishful feast, anyway, and not even the fruits or the flowers could entirely alleviate the inward agony consequent upon a morsel of raw fish, swallowed to please our host. There was music at the farther end of the palm-leaf pavilion, and thither we wended our way. The inner court was festooned with flags, and covered with a large mat. Upon the mat sat or reclined several chiefesses. I am never able to account for the audacious grace of these women, who throw themselves upon the floor and stretch their supple limbs like tigresses, with a kind of imperial scorn for your one-horse proprieties. Their voluminous light garments scarcely concealed the ample curves of their bodies, and the marvellous creatures seemed to be breathing to slow music, while their slumberous eyes regarded us with a gentle indifference that was more tantalizing than any other species of coquetry that I have knowledge of. At one side of the enclosure sat a group of musicians, twanging upon native harps, and beating the national calabash. Song after song was sung, pipe after pipe was smoked, and bits of easy and playful conversation filled the intervals. The evening waned. The eaters and drinkers were still unsatisfied, because the eatables and drinkables were not exhausted. But the moon was high and full, and the reef moaned most musically, and seemed to invite us to the shore. The great charm of a native feast is the entire absence of all formality. Every man is privileged to seek whom his heart may most desire, and every woman may receive him or reject him as her spirit prompts. We noticed that the Commodore was uneasy. He was as plump as a seal, and the crowd oppressed him. We resolved to get the old gentleman out of his misery, and proposed an immediate adjournment to the beach. The inner court was soon deserted, and our little party, which now embraced figuratively several magnificent chiefesses, as well as the primitive Hawaiian orchestra, moved in silence toward the sea. The long, curving beach glistened and sparkled in the moonlight. The sea within the reef was like a tideless river, from whose pellucid depths, where the coral spread its wilderness of branches, an unearthly radiance was reflected. A fleet of slender canoes floated to and fro upon the water, and beyond them the creaming reef flashed like a girdle of silver, belting us in from all the world. The crowning luxury of savage life is the multitudinous bondsman who anticipates your every wish, and makes you blush at your own poverty of invention by his suggestions of unimagined joys. Mats, broad, sweet, and clean, lay underfoot, and served our purpose better than Persian carpets. The sea itself fawned at our feet, and all the air was shining and soft, as though the moon had dissolved in an ecstasy, and nothing but a snap of cold weather could congeal her again. Wherever we lay, pillows were mysteriously slipped under our heads, and the willingest hands in the world began an involuntary performance of the lomi lomi. Let me not think upon the lomi lomi, for there is none of it within reach. But I may say of it that before the skilful and magnetic hands of the manipulator are folded, every nerve in the body is seized with an intense little spasm of recognition, and dies happy. A dreamless sleep succeeds, and this is followed by an awakening into new life, full of proud possibilities. We were lomi-lomied to the murmurs of the reef, and during the intervals of consciousness saw an impromptu rehearsal of the Naiad Queen in operatic form. The dancing girls, being somewhat heated, had plunged into the sea, and were complaining to the moon in a chorus of fine harmonies. History does not record how long their sea-song rang across the waters. I know that we dozed, and woke to watch a silver sail wafted along the vague and shadowy distance like a phantom. We slept again, and woke to a sense of silence broken only by the unceasing monody of the reef, slept and woke yet again in the waning light, for the moon had sunk to the ragged rim of an old crater, and seemed to have a large piece bitten out of her glorious disk. Then we broke camp by the shore, for the air was a trifle chilly, and withdrew into the seclusion of the Commodore's lanai, where we threw ourselves into hammocks and swung until daybreak. In those days we fed on lotus flowers. Jack ashore lives for the hour only, and the very air of such a latitude breathes enchantment. I believe we bathed before sunrise, and then went regularly to bed and slept till noon. Such were the Commodore's orders, and this is our apology. There was a breakfast about 1 p.m., at which we were permitted to appear in undress. The Commodore set the example by inviting us to the table in an extraordinary suit of cream-colored silk, that was suggestive of panjamas, but might have been some Oriental regalia especially designed for morning wear. He looked like a ship under full sail, rocking good-naturedly in a dead calm. The Commodore was excessively formal at first sight, that is, just before breakfast, but his heart warmed toward mankind in general, and his guests in particular, as the meal progressed. Some people never are themselves until they have broken their fast. They are so cranky, and seemed to lack ballast. The snaky steward sloughed his clothes twice a day. He was a slim, noiseless, gliding fellow at breakfast, but he was positively gorgeous at dinner. Of course, the Commodore had ordered this nice distinction in the temporal affairs of his servant, for he kept everything about the place in ship-shape, even to the flying of his private signal from sunrise to sunset at the top of a tall staff, that rivalled the royal ensign floating from a similar altitude not a quarter of a mile distant. His Majesty has a summer palace at Waikiki, and it has been whispered that the Commodore refused to recognize him, and never dipped his colors as the King cantered by in a light buggy drawn by a span of spanking bays. After breakfast the cribbage board was produced, and for 3 mortal hours the Commodore kept his peg on the steady march. At cribbage the old gentleman was expected to lose his temper. He stormed with the arrogance of a veteran card-player, with whom no man is supposed to make himself more disagreeable on short notice. Lieutenant Blank was usually the victim, but he deserved it. The true story of Lieutenant Blank (his name is suppressed out of consideration for his family) is so common in tropical seaports that I do not hope in this epitome to offer anything novel. The lieutenant was a typical Jack ashore. He had twice the mail that came to the rest of us, and he read his love letters to the mess with a gusto. He boasted fresh victims in every port, and gloried in his lack of principle. It did not surprise me at all that the lieutenant had shaken his mother. In fact, under the circumstances, I think his mother would have been justified in shaking him, if she could have got her hands on him. In the love light of the Commodore's lanai, life was very precious to this particular Jack ashore. To him a lanai was a city of refuge, provided by an all-wise Commodore for those fascinating lieutenants who are pursued by the chief women of the tribe. Yet he loved to loiter without the walls during the off hours from cribbage. No man so relished the lomi-lomi, no man, except the native-born, so clamoured for the hula-hula, and no man, not even the least of these, forgot himself to the same alarming extent whenever there was the slightest provocation. Of course he met a chiefess and surrendered. Of course he meant in time to crush the heart that pulsated with the blood royal. He simpered and tried to turn semi-savage, and was simply ridiculous. He made silly speeches in the worst possible Hawaiian, and afforded unlimited amusement to the women, who were wiser in their dark skins than the children of light. He tried to eat poi, and ruined his linen. He suffered himself to be wreathed and garlanded until he was the picture of a sacrificial calf. He gave gifts and babbled in his sleep. But in the hour when his triumph seemed inevitable, he was beautifully snubbed by his supposed victim. The sirens of Scylla are a match for any mariner who sails with unwadded ears. The lieutenant cannot hope to hear the last of that adventure, though the subject is never broached by himself. If we had dwelt 1,000 years with the Commodore, and sipped the elixir of life from the gourd that hung by the door of the wine-closet, I suppose we should have had the same daily and nightly experiences to go through with, barring a slight variation in the little matter of moonshine. But there were orders superior to the Commodore's since he was off active duty, and these orders demanded our reappearance on shipboard at an early hour of the day following. There was a farewell round of everything that had been introduced during our brief stay at Waikiki: dances, song, sea bathes, and flirtations. The moon rose higher, and was but a shadow of her former self. But the stars burned brightly, and we could still trace the noiseless flight of the solitary sail that passed like a spirit over the dusky sea. I know that in after years, whenever I come within sound of surf under the prickly sunshine, my fancy will conjure up a picture of that grass cottage on the slope of a dazzling beach, and the portly form of the old Commodore stowed snugly in the spacious hollow of a bamboo settee, drawn up on the stocks, as it were, for repairs, with a bandana spread over his face, and a dark-eyed crouching figure beside him, fighting mosquitoes with a tuft of parrot feathers. No wonder that a bodyguard of some kind was necessary, for I believe that the old Commodore's veins ran nothing but wine, and mosquitoes are good tasters. The picture would not be complete without the attendant houris, and with their image comes an echo of barbarous chants and the monotonous thump of the tom-tom, of swaying figures, of supple wrists, of slender lascivious hands, tossed skilfully in the air, seeking to interpret their pantomimic dances, and doing it with remarkable freedom and grace. I shall hear that one song, like an echo, eternally repeated, the song that was sung by all the lips that had skill to sing in every valley under the Hawaiian sun. I remember it as a refrain that was first raised in Honolulu, but for the copyright of which the respective residents of Hawaii and Niihau would willingly lay down their lives with the last words of the song rattling in their throats. Polianu, or Cool Bosom, is a fair specimen of the ballad literature of Hawaii, and the following free translation will perhaps give a suggestion of the theme. Polianu is sung by the old and decrepit, the lame, the halt, and the blind, as well as by the merest children. I have heard it caroled by a solitary boy tending goats upon the breezy heights of Kaupo. I have listened to it in the market-place, where a chorus of a dozen voices held the customer entranced. In the high winds of the middle channel, the song is raised, as the schooner lays over at a perilous angle, and ships water enough to dampen the ardor of most singers. It is sung in the church porch, by the brackish well in the desert, under the moonlit palms, and everywhere else. It cheers the midnight vigil of the prisoner, and makes glad the heart of the sorrowful. It is altogether useful as well as ornamental, and the Hawaiian who does not number among his accomplishments the ability to sing Polianu tolerably well is unworthy of the name. Polianu. Bosom, here is love for you, O bosom cool as night. How you refresh me as with dew, your coolness gives delight. Rain is cold upon the hill, and water in the pool, yet all my frame is colder still, for you, O bosom cool. Face to face beneath a bough I may not you embrace, but feel a spell on breast and brow, while sitting face to face. Thoughts in absence send a thrill, like touch of sweeter air. I sought you, and I seek you still, O bosom, cool and fair. That is all of it, but your Hawaiian turns back and begins over again until he has enough. I suppose it is no breach of confidence on my part to state that the gorgeous old Commodore is dead. There was nothing in his Lanai life to die of, except an accident, and in course of time he met with one. I forget the nature of it, but it finished him. There was wailing for 3 mortal days in the solemn shadow of the Lanai, and then one of the large, motherly-looking creatures, with numberless gauzy folds in a dress that fell straight from her broad shoulders, moved in. After 3 days of feasting, all vestiges of the Commodore's atmosphere had disappeared from the premises. I fancy she always felt at home there, although she was never known to open her lips in the presence of the Commodore's guests. Life was a little more intense after that. The snaky steward disappeared without any sort of warning. I've always believed that he crawled under some rock and laid himself away in a coil, that he will sleep for a century or so, then come out in his real character and astonish the inhabitants with his length and his slimness. Lieutenant Blank survives and sails the stormy seas on a moderate salary, the major portion of which he turns into naval buttons. I hear from him once in a dog's age. He is first at Callao, with a daily jaunt into Lima, then at one of the South Sea Paradises, next at Australia or in the China Sea, and in the future, heaven knows where. He vibrates between the 2 hemispheres, working out his time and believing himself supremely happy. I doubt not that he is happy, being about as selfish as men are made. As for myself, I am a landsman. After all that is said, the sea is rather a bore, you know, but I do not forget the dreamy days of calm in the flowering equatorial waters, nor the troubled days of storm. There are 1,001 trifling events in the fragmentary experiences of the seafarer that are of more importance than this stray leaf, but perhaps none that will serve my purpose better. For this yarn is as fine drawn as the episodes in an out-of-the-way port, with nothing but the faint odor of its fruits a little overripe, of its flowers a little overblown, and a general sense of uncomfortable warmth, to give it individuality. I have found these experiences excellent memories, for though the dull waits between the acts and the sluggishness of the action at best are a little dreary at times, they are forgotten, together with most disagreeable matter. I'll warrant you, Lieutenant Blank, strutting his little hour between decks, or in the fleeting moments of the delectable dog-watch, muses upon the past. When he has aroused the fever in his blood and can no longer hold his tongue, he heaves an ominous sigh, knits his brows, and in a voice that quivers with unaffected emotion, he whispers to the marines the beguiling romance of his love life in a lanai. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of South Sea Idyls by Charles Warren Stoddard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, In a Transport. A little French aspirant de marine, with an incipient moustache, said to me confidentially, "Where you see the French flag, you see France." We were pacing to and fro on the deck of a transport that swung at anchor off San Francisco, and, as I looked shoreward for almost the last time, we were to sail at daybreak for a southern cruise, I hugged my Ollendorf in despair as I dreamed of French in 6 easy lessons, without a master, or a tolerable accent, or anything save a suggestion of babble and a confusion of tongues at sea. Thanaron, the aspirant in question, embraced me when I boarded the transport with my baggage, treated me like a long-lost brother all that afternoon, and again embraced me when I went ashore toward evening to take leave of my household. There was something so impulsive and boyish in his manner that I immediately returned his salute, and with considerable fervor, feeling that kind Heaven had thrown me into the arms of the exceptional foreigner who would, to a certain extent, console me for the loss of my whole family. The mystery that hangs over the departure of any craft that goes by wind is calculated to appall the landsman, and when the date of sailing is fixed, the best thing he can do is to go aboard in season and compose his soul in peace. To be sure, he may swing at anchor for a day or two, in full sight of the domestic circle that he has shattered, but he is spared the repetition of those last agonies, and cut short the unravelling hours just prior to a separation, which are probably the most unsatisfactory in life. Under cover of darkness, a fellow can do almost anything, and I concluded to go on board. There was a late dinner, and a parting toast at home, and those ominous silences in the midst of a conversation that was as spasmodic and disconnected and unnatural as possible. There was something on our minds, and we relapsed in turn, and forgot ourselves in the fathomless abysses of speculation. Someone saw me off that night, someone who will never again follow me to the sea, and welcome me on my return to earth after my wandering. We sauntered down the dark streets along the city front, and tried to disguise our motives, but it was hard work. Presently we heard the slow swing of the tide under us, and the musty odor of the docks regaled us. One or two shadows seemed to be groping about in the neighborhood, making more noise than a shadow has any right to make. Then came the myriad-masted shipping, the twinkling lights in the harbor, and a sense of ceaseless motion in waters that never can be still. We did not tarry there long. The boat was bumping her bow against a pair of slippery stairs that led down to the water, and I entered the tottering thing that half sunk under me, dropped into my seat in the stern, and tried to call out something or other as we shot away from the place, with a cloud over my eyes that was darker than night itself, and a cloud over my heart that was as heavy as lead. After that there was nothing to do but climb up one watery swell and slide down on the other side of it, to count the shadow ships that shaped themselves out of chaos as we drew near them, and dissolved again when we had passed, while the oars seemed to grunt in the row-locks, and the two jolly tars in uniform (they might have been mutes for all I know) swung to and fro, dragging me over the water to my ocean bride. I think that is what they call a ship when the mood is on them. She did look pretty as we swam up under her. She looked like a great silhouette against the steel gray sky. But within was the sound of revelry, and I hastened on board to find our little cabin blue with smoke, which, however, was scarcely dense enough to muffle the martial strains of the Marseillaise, as shouted by the whole mess. Thaneron, my Thaneron, was in the centre of the table, with his curly head out of the transom. Not that he was by any means a giant, but we were all a little cramped between decks, and he was leading the chorus with a sabre in one hand and the head of the doctor in the other. Without the support of the faculty, he would probably not have ended his song of triumph as successfully as he ultimately did, when nature herself had fainted from exhaustion. It was the last night in port, a few friends from shore had come to dine, and black coffee and cognac at a late hour had finished the business. If there is one thing in this world that astonishes me more than another, it is the rapidity with which some people talk in French. Thaneron's French, when he once got started, sounded to me like the well-executed trill of a prima donna, and quite as intelligible. The joke of it was that Frenchmen seemed to find no difficulty in understanding him at his highest speed. On the whole, perhaps, this fact astonishes me more than the other. Dinner was as far over as it could get without beginning again and calling itself breakfast, so the party broke up in a whirlwind of patriotic songs, and one by one we dropped our guests over the side of the vessel until there was none left, and then we waved them 1,000 adieus and kept up the last words as long as we could catch the faintest syllable of a reply. There were streaks of dull red in the east by this time, and the outlines of the city were again becoming visible. This I dreaded a little, and when our boat had returned and everything was put in ship-shape, I deliberately dropped a tear in the presence of my messmates, who were overcome with emotion at the spectacle, and, having all embraced, we went below, where I threw myself with some caution into my hammock and slept until broad daylight. I did not venture on deck again until after our first breakfast, an informal one, that sat uneasily on the table, and seemed inclined to make its escape from one side or the other. Of course, we were well under way by this time. I was assured of the fact by the reckless rolling of the vessel, and the strange and unfamiliar feeling in my stomach, as though it were some other fellow's stomach, and not my own. My legs were a trifle uncertain, my head was queer. Everybody was rushing everywhere and doing things that had to be undone or done over again in the course of the next 10 minutes. I concluded to pace the deck, which is probably the correct thing for a man to do when he goes down to the sea in ships, and does business you could hardly call it pleasure on great waters. I went up the steep companionway and found a deck-load of ropes, and the entire crew, dressed in blue flannel with broad collars, skipping about in the most fantastic manner. It was like a ballet scene in L'Africaine, and highly diverting for a few minutes. From my stronghold on the top stair of the companionway I cast my eye shoreward. The long coast ran down the horizon under a broadside of breakers that threatened to engulf the continent. The air was grey with scattering mist, the sea was much disturbed, and of that ugly yellowish-green tint that signifies soundings. Overhead a few sea-birds whirled in disorder, shrieking as though their hearts would break. It looked ominous, yet I felt it my duty as an American under the shadow of the tricolor to keep a stiff upper lip, and I flatter myself that I did so. Figuratively speaking, I balanced myself in the mouth of the companionway, with a bottle of claret in one pocket and a French roll in the other, while I brushed the fog from my eyes with the sleeve of my monkey jacket, and exclaimed with the bard, "My native land, good night." It was morning at the time, but I did not seem to care much. In fact, time is not of the slightest consequence on shipboard. So I withdrew to my hammock, and having climbed into it in safety, ended the day after a miserable fashion that I have deplored 1,000 times since, during the prouder moments of my life. A week passed by. I suppose it was a week, for I could reckon only 7 days and 7 nights of about twice the length of the days during that interval. Yet I should, in the innocence of my heart, have called it a month, without a moment's hesitation. We arose late in the morning, those of us who had a watch below, ate a delightfully long and narrow breakfast, consisting of an interminable procession of dishes in single file, paced the deck and canvassed the weather, went below to read, but talked instead, dined as we had breakfast, only in a far more elaborate and protracted manner, while a gentle undercurrent of side dishes lent interest to the occasion. There was a perpetual stream of conversation playing over the table, from the moment that heralded the soup until the last drop of black coffee was sopped up with a bit of dry bread. By the time we had come to cheese, everybody felt called upon to say his say, in the face of everybody else. I alone kept my place, and held it because the heaviest English I knew fell feebly to the floor before the thunders of those 5 prime Frenchmen, who were flushed with enthusiasm and good wine. I dreamed of home over my cigarette, and tried to look as though I were still interested in life, when, heaven knows, my face was more like a half-obliterated cameo of despair than anything human. Thanaron, my foreign affinity, now and then threw me a semi-English nut to crack, but by the time I had recovered myself it is rather embarrassing to be assaulted even in the most friendly manner with a batch of broken English. By the time I had framed an intelligible response, Thanaron was in the heat of a fresh argument, and keeping up a running fire of small shot that nearly floored the mess. But there is an end even to a French dinner, and we ultimately adjourned to the deck, where, about sunset, everybody took his station while the Angelus was said. Then twilight, with a subdued kind of skylarking in the forecastle, and genteel merriment amidships, while Monsieur le Capitaine paced the high quarter-deck with the shadow of a smile, crouching between the fierce jungles of his intensely black side whiskers. Oh, sir, it was something to be at sea in a French transport, with the tricolor flaunting at the peak; to have 4 guns with their mouths gagged and oilcloth capes lashed snugly over them; to see everybody in uniform, each having the profoundest respect for those who ranked a notch above them, and having also an ill-disguised contempt for the unlucky fellow beneath him. This spirit was observable from one end of the ship to the other, and, sirs, we had a little world of our own revolving on a wobbling axis between the staunch ribs of the old transport Chevert. We were bound for Tahiti, God willing, and the winds favorable, and the common hope of ultimately finding port in that paradise is all that held us together through thick and thin. We might wrangle at dinner, and come to breakfast next morning with bitterness in our hearts; we might sink into the bottomless pit of despond; we might revile Monsieur le Capitaine and Monsieur le Cuisinier, including in our anathemas the elements and some other things; they, the Frenchmen, might laugh to scorn the great American people, and they did it 2 or 3 times; and I, in my turn, might feel a secret contempt for Paris, without having the power to express the same in tolerable French, so I felt it, and held my tongue. Even Thanaron gave me a French shrug now and then that sent the cold shivers through me; but there was sure to come a sunset like a sea of fire, at which golden hour we were marshalled amidships, and stood with uncovered heads, and the soft light playing over us, while the littlest French boy in the crew said the evening prayer with exceeding sweetness; being the youngest, he was the most worthy of saying it, and then we all crossed ourselves, and our hearts melted within us. There was something in the delicious atmosphere, growing warmer every day, and something in the delicious sea, that was beginning to rock her floating gardens of blooming weed under our bows, and something in the aspect of Monsieur le Capitaine, with his cap off and a shadow of prayer softening his hard, proud face, that unmanned us. So we rushed to our own little cabin, and hugged one another, lest we should forget how, when we were restored to our sisters and our sweethearts; and everything was forgiven and forgotten in one intense moment of French remorse. Who took me in his arms and carried me the length of the cabin in 3 paces, at the imminent peril of my life? Thanaron. Who admired Thanaron's gush of nature, and nearly squeezed the life out of him in the vain hope of making their joy known to him? Everybody else in the mess. Who looked on in bewilderment, and was half glad and half sorry, though more glad than sorry by half, and wondered all the while what was coming next? Bless you, it was I! And we kept doing that sort of thing until I got very used to it, and by the time we sighted the green summits of Tahiti, my range of experience was so great that nothing could touch me further. It may be that we were not governed by the laws of ordinary seafarers. The Chevert was shaped a little like a bathtub, with a bow like a duck's breast, and a high, old-fashioned quarter-deck resembling a Chinese junk with a reef in her stern. 40 bold sailor boys, who looked as though they had been built on precisely the same model and dealt out to the government by the dozen, managed to keep the decks very clean and tidy, and the brasswork in a state of dazzling brightness. The ship was wonderfully well ordered. I could tell you, by the sounds on deck, while I swung in the comfortable seclusion of my hammock, just the hour of the day or night, but that was after I had once learned the order of events. There was the Sunday morning inspection, the Wednesday sham naval battle, the prayers night and morning, and the order to shorten sail each evening. Between times the decks were scrubbed and the whole ship renovated. Sometimes the rigging was darkened with drying clothes, and sometimes we felt like ancient mariners, the sea was so oily and the air so hot and still. There was nothing stirring save the sea-birds, who paddled about like tame ducks, and the faint, thin thread of smoke that ascended noiselessly from the dainty rolls of tobacco in the fingers of the entire ship's crew. In fact, when we moved at all in these calm waters, we seemed to be propelled by 40 cigarette power, for there was not a breath of air stirring. It was at such times that we fought our bloodless battles. The hours were ominous, breakfast did not seem half a breakfast, because we hurried through it with the dreadful knowledge that a conflict was pending, and possibly, though not probably, we might never gather at that board again, for a naval engagement is something terrible, and life is uncertain in the fairest weather. Breakfast is scarcely over when the alarm is given, and with the utmost speed every Frenchman flies to his post. Already the horizon is darkened with the Prussian navy, yet our confidence in the staunch old chevalier, in each particular soul on board, and in our undaunted leader, Monsieur le Capitaine, who is even now scouring the sea with an enormous marine glass that of itself is enough to strike terror to the Prussian heart. Our implicit confidence in ourselves is such that we smilingly await the approach of the doomed fleet. At last they come within range of our guns, and the conflict begins. I am unfortunately compelled to stay beneath the hatches. A sham battle is no sight for an inexperienced landsman to witness, and, moreover, I would doubtless get in the way of the frantic crew, who seem resolved to shed the last drop of French blood in behalf of la belle France. Marine engagements are, as a general thing, a great bore. The noise is something terrific. Ammunition is continually passed up through the transom over our dinner table, and 1,000 feet are rushing over the deck with a noise as of theatrical thunder. The engagement lasts for an hour or two. Once or twice we are enveloped in sheets of flame. We are speedily deluged with water, and the conflict is renewed with the greatest enthusiasm. Again and again and again we pour a broadside into the enemy's fleet, and always with terrific effect. We invariably do ourselves the greatest credit, for by the time our supplies are about exhausted, not a vestige of the once glorious navy of Prussia remains to tell the tale. The sea is, of course, blood-stained for miles around. The few persistent Prussians who attempt to board us are speedily dispatched and allowed to drop back into the remorseless waves. A shout of triumph rings up from our triumphant crew, and the play is over. Once more the hatches are removed. Once more I breathe the sweet air of heaven, for not a grain of powder has been burned through all this fearful conflict. Once more my messmates rush into our little cabin and regale themselves with copious draughts of absinthe, and I am pressed to the proud bosom of Thanaron, who is restored to me without a scar to disfigure his handsome little body. I grew used to these weekly wars, and before we came in sight of our green haven there was not a Prussian left in the Pacific. It is impossible that any nation, though they be schooled to hardships, could hope to survive such a succession of disastrous conflicts. On the whole, I like sham battles. They are deuced exciting, and they don't hurt. How different, how very different, those sleepy days when we were drifting on toward the Marquesas Islands. The silvery phaetons darted overhead like day stars shooting from their spheres. The seaweed grew denser, and a thousand floating things, broken branches with a few small leaves attached, the husk of a cocoanut, or straws such as any dove from any ark would be glad to seize upon, these gave us ample food for speculation. Piloted by the slow, unwilling winds, we came close to the starlit Nuka Hiva, and shortened sail right under its fragrant shadow. It was a glorious night. There was the subtle odor of earth in the warm, faint air, and before us that impenetrable shadow that we knew to be an island, yet whose outlines were traceable only by the obliterated stars. At sunrise we were on deck, and looked westward, saw the mists melt away like a veil swept from before the face of a dusky Venus just rising from the waves. The island seemed to give out a kind of magnetic heat that made our blood tingle. We gravitated toward it with an almost irresistible impulse. Something had to be done before we yielded to the fascination of this savage enchantress. Our course lay to the windward of the southeastern point of the land, but finding that we could not weather it, we went off before the light wind and drifted down the northern coast, swinging an hour or more under the lee of some parched rocks, eyeing the Needles, the slender and symmetrical peaks so called, and then we managed to work our way out into the open sea again, and were saved. Valleys lay here and there, running back from the shore with green and inviting vistas. Slim waterfalls made one desperate leap from the clouds and buried themselves in the forests hundreds of feet below, where they were lost forever. Rain clouds hung over the mountains, throwing deep shadows across the slopes that but for this relief would have been too bright for the sentimental beauty that usually identifies a tropical island. I happened to know something about the place, and marked every inch of the scorching soil as we floated past groves of rosewood, sandalwood, and 100 sorts of new and strange trees, looking dark and velvety in the distance; past strips of beach that shone like brass, while beyond them the cocoa palms that towered above the low, brown huts of the natives seemed to reel and nod in the intense meridian heat. A moist cloud, far up the mountain, hung above a serene and sacred haunt, and under its shelter was hidden a deep valley, whose secret has been carried to the ends of the earth. For Herman Melville has plucked out the heart of its mystery, and beautiful and barbarous Tippee lies naked and forsaken. I was rather glad we could not get any nearer to it, for fear of dispelling the ideal that has so long charmed me. Catching the wind again, late in the afternoon, we lost the last outline of Nuka Hiva in the soft twilight, and said our prayers that evening as much at sea as ever. Back we dropped into the solemn round of uneventful days. Even the sham battles no longer thrilled us. In fact, the whole affair was a little too theatrical to bear frequent repetition. There was but one of our mess who could muster an episode whenever we became too stagnant for our health's good, and this was our first officer, a tall, slim fellow with a warlike beard and very soft, dark eyes, whose pupils seemed to be floating aimlessly about under the shelter of long lashes. His face was in a perpetual dispute with itself, and I never knew which was the right or the wrong side of him. B was the happy possessor of a tight little African known as Nero, although I always looked upon him as so much Jamaica ginger. Nero was as handsome a specimen of tangible darkness as you will sight in a summer's cruise. B loved with the ardor of his vacillating eyes, yet governed with the rigor of his beard. Nero was consequently prepared for any change in the weather, no matter how sudden or uncalled for. In the equatorial seas, while we sailed to the measure of the Ancient Mariner, B summoned Nero to the sacrifice, and having tortured him to the extent of his wits, there was a reconciliation more ludicrous than any other scene in the farce. It was at such moments that B's eyes literally swam, when even his beard wilted, while he told of the thousand pathetic eras in Nero's life, when he might have had his liberty, but found the service of his master more beguiling; of the adventures by flood and field, where B was distinguishing himself, yet at his side, through thick and thin, struggled the faithful Nero. Thus B warmed himself at the fire his own enthusiasm had kindled on the altar of self-love, and every moment added to his fervor. It was the yellow fever, and the cholera, and the smallpox that were powerless to separate that faithful slave from the agonizing bedside of his master. It was shipwreck and famine and the smallest visible salary that seemed only to strengthen the ties that bound them the one to the other. Death, cruel death, alone could separate them, and B took Nero by the throat and kissed him passionately upon his sooty cheek, and the floating eyes came to a standstill with an expression of virtuous defiance that was calculated to put all conventionalities to the blush. We were awed by the magnanimity of such conduct until we got thoroughly used to it, and then we were simply entertained. We kept looking forward to the conclusion of the scene, which usually followed in the course of half an hour. B having fondled Nero to his heart's content, and Nero having become somewhat bored, there was sure to arise some mild disturbance aggravated by both parties, and B, believing he had endured as much as any Frenchman and first officer is expected to endure without resentment, suddenly rises and, seizing Nero by the short, wiry moss of his scalp, kicks him deliberately from the cabin, and returns to us bursting with indignation. This domestic equinox we soon grew fond of, and having become familiar with all its signals of approach, we watched with agreeable interest the inevitable climax. It was well for Nero that nature had provided against any change of color in his skin, for he must have borne the sensation of his chastisement for some hours, though he was unable to give visible expression of it. By and by came B's own private birthday. Nothing had been said of it at table, and, in fact, nothing elsewhere that I remember, but Nero, who had survived several of those anniversaries, bore it in mind, and our dinner was something gorgeous to look at. Unhappily, certain necessary ingredients had been unavoidably omitted in the concocting of the dessert, ornamental pastry not being set down in our regular bill of fare. But B ate of pies that were built of chips, and of puddings that were stuffed with sawdust, until I feared we should be called upon to mourn the loss of a first officer before morning. Moreover, B insisted that everything was unsurpassed, and Heaven be thanked. I believe the pastry could easily lay claim to that distinction. At any rate, never before or since have I laid teeth to such a Dead Sea dessert. At this point B naturally called Nero to him and thanked him, with moist and truthful eyes, and the ingenuous little Jamaican dropped a couple of colorless tears that would easily have passed for anybody's anywhere. For this mutual exhibition of sentiment every one of us was duly grateful, and we never afterward scored B for his eccentricities, since we knew him to be capable of genuine feeling. Moreover, he nearly died of his birthday feast, yet did not once complain of the unsuspecting cause of all his woe, who was at his side night and day, anticipating all his wishes, and deploring the unaccountable misfortunes of his master. So the winds blew us into the warm south latitudes. I was getting restless. Perhaps we had talked ourselves out of legitimate topics of conversation, and were forcing the social element. It was tedious beyond expression, passing day after day within sound of the same voices, and being utterly unable to flee into never so small a solitude, for there was not an inch of it on board. Swinging at night in my hammock between decks, wakefully dreaming of the future and of the past, again and again I have stolen up on deck, where the watch lay in the moonlight, droning their interminable yarns and smoking their perpetual cigarettes, for French sailors have privileges and improve them with considerable grace. It was at such times that the wind sung in the rigging, with the sound as of 1,000 swaying branches full of quivering leaves, just as the soft gale in the garden groves suggests pleasant nights at sea, the vibration of the taut stays and the rush of waters along the smooth sides of the vessel. A ship's rigging is a kind of sea harp played upon by the four winds of heaven. The sails were half in moonlight and half in shadow. Every object was well defined, and on the high quarter-deck paced Fanaron, his boyish figure looking strangely picturesque, for he showed in every motion how deeply he felt the responsibility of his office. There was usually a faint light in the apartments of Monsieur le Capitaine, and I thought of him in his gold lace and dignity, poring over a French novel or cursing the light winds. I used to sit upon the neck of a gun, one of our 4 dummies that were never known to speak louder than a whisper, lay my head against the moist bulwarks, and listen to the half-savage chants of the Tahitian sailors who helped to swell our crew. As we drew down toward the enchanted islands, they seemed fairly bewitched, and it was with the utmost difficulty that they could keep their mouths shut, until evening, when they were sure to begin intoning an epic that usually lasted through the watch. Sometimes a fish leaped into the moonlight and came down with a splash, or a whale heaved a great sigh close to us, and as I looked over the bulwarks I would catch a glimpse of the old fellow just going down like a submerged island. Occasionally a flying fish, a kind of tangible moonbeam, fell upon deck and was secured by one of the sailors, or a bird sailing about with an eye to roosting on one of our yards gave a plaintive, ominous cry that was echoed in falsetto by 2 or 3 voices, and rung in with the Tahitian cantata of island delights. Even this sort of thing lost its charm after a little. Fanaron could not speak to me, because Fanaron was officer of the deck at that moment, and Fanaron himself had said to me, "Order, monsieur, order is the first law of France." I had always supposed that Heaven had a finger in the making of that law, but it is all the same to a Frenchman. Most sea days have a tedious family resemblance, their chief characteristic being the almost total absence of any distinguishing feature. Fair weather and foul, sunlight, moonlight, and starlight, moments of confidence, oaths of eternal fidelity, plans for the future long enough to crowd a century uncomfortably, relapses, rows, recoveries. Then, after many days, the water subsided, and we saw land at last. Land, God bless it! Long, low coral reefs, with a strip of garden glorifying them, rocks towering out of the sea, palm-crowned, foam-fringed, wreaths of verdure cast upon the bosom of the ocean, forever fragrant in their imperishable beauty, and beyond and above them all, gorgeous and glorious Tahiti. On the morning of the 33rd day out there came a revelation to the whole ship's company. A faint blue peak was seen struggling with the billows. Presently it seemed to get the better of them, growing broader and taller, but taking hours to do so. The wind was stiff, and the sea covered with foam. We rolled frightfully all day. Our French dinner lost its identity. Soup was out of the question. We had hard work to keep meat and vegetables from total wreck, while we hung on to the legs of the table with all our strength. How the old chèvre bucked that day, as though conscious that for months to come she would swing in still waters by the edge of green pastures, where any such conduct would be highly inappropriate. Every hour the island grew more and more beautiful, as though it were some lovely fruit or flower, swiftly and magically coming to maturity. A central peak, with a tiara of rocky points, crowns it with majesty, and a neighboring island of great beauty seems its faithful attendant. I do not wonder that the crew of the Bounty mutinied when they were ordered to make sail, and turned their backs on Tahiti, nor am I surprised that they put the captain and one or two other objectionable features into a small boat, and advised them to continue their voyage if they were anxious to do so. But as for them, give them Tahiti, or give them worse than death; and if convenient, give them Tahiti straight, and keep all the rest for the next party that came along. As soon as we were within hailing distance, the pilot came out and took us under his wing. We kissed the hand of a citizen of the New World, and for the first time since losing sight of the dear California coast, dismissed it from our minds. There was very little wind right under the great green mountains, so the frigate Astrea sent a dozen boats to tow us through the opening in the reef to our most welcome anchorage. No Doge of Venice ever cruised more majestically than we, and our sea pageant was the sensation of the day. Click, click, went the anchor chain through the hawse holes, down into a deep, sheltered bowl of the sea, whose waters have never yet been ruffled by the storms that beat upon the coral wall around it. Along the crescent shores trees dropped their yellow leaves into the water, and tried their best to bury the slim canoes drawn up among their roots. Beyond this barricade of verdure, the eye caught glimpse of every sort of tropical habitation imaginable, together with the high roofs and ponderous white walls of the French government buildings. The foliage broke over the little town like a green sea, and every possibility of a good view of it was lost in the inundation. Above it towered the sublime crest of the mountain, with a strip of cloud about its middle in true savage fashion. Perpetual harvest lay in its lap, and it basked in the smile of God. Twilight, fragrant and cool, a fruity flavor in the air, a flower-like tint in sea and sky, the ship's boat waiting to convey us shoreward. O Thaneron, my Thaneron, with your arms about my neck, and B's arms about you, and Nero clinging to his master's knees, in fact, with everybody felicitating every other body, because it was such an evening as descends only upon the chosen places of the earth, and because, having completed our voyage in safety, we were all literally in a transport. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of South Sea Idyls by Charles Warren Stoddard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, A Prodigal in Tahiti. Let this confession be topped with a vignette done in broad, shadowless lines, and few of them. Something like this: a little fly-blown room smelling of garlic. I, cooling my elbows on the oily slab of a table, breakfast for one, and looking through a window at a glaring whitewashed fence high enough to shut out the universe from my point of sight. Yet it hid not all, since it brought into relief a panting cock, with one leg in a string, which had so strained to compress itself into a doubtful inch of shade that its suspended claw clutched the air in real agony. Having dazzled my eyes with this prospect, I turned gratefully to the vanities of life that may be had for 2 francs in Tahiti. Vide bill of fare: 1 fried egg, like the eye of some gigantic albino; potatoes hollowed out bombshell fashion, primed with liver sausage, very ingenious and palatable; the naked corpse of a fowl that cared not to live longer, from appearances, yet looked not happy in death. Item: wonder if there is a more ghastly spectacle than a chicken cooked in the French style, its knees drawn up on its breast like an Indian mummy, while its blue back, parboiled, and melancholy visage tearfully surveys its own unshrouded remains. After a brief season of meditation, I said, and I trust I meant it, I thank the Lord for all these blessings. Then I gave the corpse of the chicken Christian burial under a fold of the window curtain, disposed of the fried eye of the albino, and transformed myself into a mortar for the time being, taking potato bombshells according to my caliber. There was claret all the while, and plenty of butterless roll, a shaving of cheese, a banana, black coffee, and cognac, when I turned again to dazzle myself with the white fence, and saw with infinite pity a sentiment perhaps not unmixed with a suspicion of cognac, or some other temporary humanizing element, I saw for a fact that the poor cock had wilted, and lay flat in the sun like a last year's duster. That was too much for me. I wheeled towards the door, where gleamed the bay with its lovely ridges of light. Canoes drifting over it drew the eye after them irresistibly. I heard the ship caulkers on the beach making their monotonous clatter, and the drone of the bare-headed fruit sellers squatted in rows, chatting indolently with their eyes half shut. I could think of nothing but bees humming over their own sweet wares. About this time a young fellow at the next table, who had scarcely a mouthful of English at his command, implored me to take beer with him, implying that we might, if desirable, become as tight as two bricks. I declined, much to his admiration, he regarding my refusal as a clear case of moral courage, whereas it arose simply and solely from my utter inability to see his treat and go him one better. A grown person in Tahiti has an eating hour allotted to him twice a day, at 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. My time being up, I returned to the store in an indifferent frame of mind, and upon entering the presence of my employer, who had arrived a moment before me, I was immediately covered with the deep humiliation of servitude, and withdrew to an obscure corner, while Monsieur and some naval guest took absinthe unblushingly, which was, of course, proper enough in them. Call it by what name you will, you cannot sweeten servility to my taste. Then why was I there, and in bondage? The spirit of adventure that keeps life in us, yet comes near to worrying it out of us now and then, lured me with my handful of dollars to the garden of the Pacific. "You can easily get work," said someone who had been there and didn't want it. If work I must, why not better there than here? Thought I. And the less money I take with me, the surer am I to seek that which might not attract me under other circumstances. A few letters which proved almost valueless, an abiding trust in Providence, afterwards somewhat shaken, I am sorry to state, which convinces me that I can no longer hope to travel as a shorn lamb. Considerable confidence in the good feeling of my fellow men, together with the few dollars above referred to, comprised my all when I set foot on the leaf-strewn and shady beach of Papeete. Before the day was over, I saw my case was almost hopeless. I was one too many in a very meagre congregation of foreigners. In a week I was desperate, with poverty and disgrace brooding like evil spirits on either hand. Every 10 minutes someone suggested something which was almost immediately suppressed by the next man I met, to whom I applied for further information. "Teach," said one. There wasn't a pupil to be had in the Dominion. Clerkships were out of the question likewise. I might keep store if I could get anything to put in it, or go farther, as someone suggested, if I had money enough to get there. I thought it wiser to endure the ills I had, than fly to others that I knew not of. In this state I perambulated the green lanes of Papeete, conscious that I was drawing down tons of immaterial sympathy from hearts of various nationalities, beating to the music of regular salaries in hard cash, and the inevitable ringing of their daily dinner bell. And I continued to perambulate under the same depressing avalanches for a fortnight or more, a warning to the generation of the inexperienced that persists in sowing itself broadcast upon the edges of the earth, and learns too late how hard a thing it is to take root under the circumstances. One gloomy day I was seized in the market-place and led before a French gentleman, who offered me a bed and board for such manual compensation as I might be able to give him in his office during the usual business hours, namely from daybreak to some time in the afternoon, unless it rained, when business was suspended, and I was dropped until fair weather should set that little world wagging again. I was invited to enter into the bosom of his family, in fact, to be one of them, and no single man could ask to be more, to sit at his table and hope for better days, in which diversion he proposed to join me with all his soul. With an emotion of gratitude and a pang at being thus early a subject of charity, I began business in Papeete, and learned within the hour how sharper than most sharps it is to know only your own mother tongue when you're away from home. Nightly I walked 2 hot and dusty miles through groves of breadfruit and colonnades of palms to my new masters. I skirted, with loitering steps, a placid sea, whose crystalline depths sheltered leagues and leagues of sun-painted corals, where a myriad fish, dyed like the rainbow, sported unceasingly. Springs gushed from the mountain, singing their song of joy. The winds sang in the dark locks of the sycamore, while the palm boughs clashed like cymbals in rhythmical accompaniment. Glad children chanted their choruses, and I alone could not sing, nor hum, nor whistle, because it doesn't pay to work for your board and settle for little necessities out of your own pocket in any latitude that I ever heard of. We lived in a grove of 10,000 cocoa palms, crowning a hill slope to the west. How all-sufficient it sounds as I write it now, but how little I cared then, for many reasons. My cottage had prior tenants who disputed possession with me, winged tenants who sought admission at every cranny, and frequently obtained it in spite of me. These were not angels, but hens. My cottage had been a granary until it got too poor a receptacle for grains, and a better shelter left it open to the barn fowls until I arrived. They hated me, these hungry chickens. They used to sit in rows on the window-sill and stare me out of countenance. A wide bedstead, corded with thongs, did its best to furnish my apartment. A very narrow and thin ship's mattress, that had been a bed of torture for many a seasick soul before it descended to me. A flat pillow like a pancake. A condemned horse blanket, contributed by a good-natured Kanak, who raked it from a heap of refuse in the yard, together with 2 sacks of rice, the despair of those hens in the window, were all I could boast of. With this inventory I strove, by particular request, to be one of those who were comfortable enough in the chateau adjoining. Summoned peremptorily to dinner, I entered a little latticed saloon connected with the chateau by a covered walk, discovered messieurs seated at table and already served with soup and claret. The remainder of the company helped themselves as they best could, and I saw plainly enough that the family bosom was so crowded already that I might seek in vain to wedge myself into any corner of it, at least until some vacancy occurred. After dinner, sat on a sack of rice in my room while it grew dark and Monsieur received calls, wandered down to the beach at the foot of the hill, and lay a long time on a bed of leaves while the tide was out and the crabs clattered along shore and were very sociable. Natives began to kindle their evening fires of cocoanut husks. Smoke, sweet as incense, climbed up to the plumes of the palm trees and was lost among the stars. Morsels of fish and breadfruit were offered me by the untutored savage, who welcomed me to his frugal meal, and desired that I should at least taste before he broke his fast. Canoes shot out from dense, shadowy points, fishers standing in the bows with a poised spear in one hand. A blazing palm branch held aloft in the other shed a warm glow of light over their superb nakedness. Bathed by the sea in a fresh, cool spring, and returned to my little coop, which was illuminated by the glare of 50 floating beacons. Looking back from the door, I could see the dark outlines of the torch-bearers and hear their signal calls above the low growl of the reef, a half-mile farther out from shore. It was a blessing to lie awake in my little room and watch the flicker of those fires, to think how Tahiti must look on a cloudless night from some heavenly altitude, the ocean still as death, the procession of fishermen sweeping from point to point within the reef, till the island, flooded with starlight and torchlight, lies like a green sea-garden in a girdle of flame. A shrill bell called me from my bed at dawn. I was not unwilling to rise. For half the night I lay like a saint on the tough thongs, having turned over in sleep, thereby missing the mattress entirely. Made my toilette at a spring on the way into town, saw a glorious sunrise that was as good as breakfast, and found the whole earth and sea and all that in them is singing again, while I listened and gave thanks for that privilege. At 10 a.m. I went to breakfast in the small restaurant where I have sketched myself at the top of this chronicle, and whither we may return and begin over again, if it please you. I was about to remark that probably most melancholy and homesickness may be cured or alleviated by a wholesome meal of victuals, but I think I won't, for on referring to my notebook, I find that within an hour after my return to the store, I was as heartsick as ever, and wasn't afraid to say so. It is scarcely to be wondered at. The sky was dark. Aboard a schooner some sailors were making that doleful whine peculiar to them, as they hauled in to shore and tied up to a tree in a sifting rain. Then everything was ominously still, as though something disagreeable were about to happen. Thereupon I doubled myself over the counter like a half-shut jackknife, and burying my face in my hands, said to myself, "Oh, to be alone with nature! Her silence is religion, and her sounds sweet music." After which the rain blew over, and I was sent with a handcart and one underfed Kanak to a wharf half a mile away to drag back several loads of potatoes. We two hungry creatures struggled heroically to do our duty. Starting with a multitude of sacks it was quite impossible to proceed with, we grew weaker the farther we went, so that the load had to be reduced from time to time, and I believe the amount of potatoes deposited by the way considerably exceeded the amount we subsequently arrived at the store with. Finding life a burden, and seeing the legs of the young fellow in harness with me bend under him in his frantic efforts to get our cart out of a rut without emptying it entirely, I resolved to hire a substitute at my own expense, and save my remaining strength for a new line of business. Thus I was enabled to sit on the wharf the rest of the afternoon, and enjoy myself devising new means of subsistence and watching the natives swim. Some one before me found a modicum of sweets in his cup of bitterness, and in a complacent hour set the good against the evil in single entry, summing up the same to his advantage. I concluded to do it myself, and did it thus. Evil. I find myself in a foreign land with no one to love and none to love me. Good. But I may do as I please in consequence, and it is nobody's business save my own. Evil. I am working for my board and lodging, no extra, and find it very unprofitable. Good. But I may quit as soon as I feel like it, and shall have no occasion to dun my employer for back salary, so long as I stop with him. Evil. My clothes are in rags. I shall soon be without a stitch to my back. Good. But the weather is mild, and the fig tree flourisheth. Moreover, many a good savage has gone naked before me. Evil. I get hungry before breakfast, and feel faint after dinner. What are 2 meals a day to a man of my appetite? Good. But fasting is saintly. Day by day I grow more spiritual, and shall shortly be a fit subject for translation to that better world which is doubtless the envy of all those who have lost it by overeating and drinking. Nothing can exceed the satisfaction with which I read and reread this philosophical summary, but I had relapses every few minutes so long as I lived in Tahiti. I remember one Sunday morning, a day I had all to myself, when I cried out of the depths and felt better after it. It was a real Sunday. The fowls confessed it by the indifference with which they picked up a grain of rice now and then, as though they weren't hungry. The family were moving about in an unnatural way. Some people are never themselves on the Lord's Day. The canoes lay asleep off upon the water, evidently conscious of the long hours of rest they were sure of having. To sum it all, it seemed as though the cover had been taken off from the earth, and the angels were sitting in big circles looking at us. Our clock had run down, and I found myself half an hour too early at Mass. Some diminutive native children talked together with infinite gesticulation like little old men. At every lag in the conversation, 2 or 3 of them would steal away to the fence that surrounded the church and begin diligently counting the pickets thereof. They were evidently amazed at what they considered a singular coincidence, namely, that the number of pickets, beginning at the front gate and counting to the right, tallied exactly with the doo-doo, beginning at the doo-doo and counting to the left. While they were making repeated efforts to get at the heart of this mystery, the priest rode up on horseback, dismounted in our midst, and we all followed him into chapel to Mass. A young Frenchman offered me holy water on the tips of his fingers, and I immediately decided to confide in him to an unlimited extent if he gave me the opportunity. It was a serious disappointment when I found later that we didn't know 6 words in any common tongue. Concluded to be independent and walked off by myself. Got very lonesome immediately. Tried to be meditative, philosophical, botanical, conchological, and in less than an hour gave it up. Homesick again, by Jove. Strolled to the beach and sat a long time on a bit of wreck partly embedded in the sand. Consoled by the surpassing radiance of sunset, wondered how I could ever have repined, but proceeded to do it again as soon as it grew dark. Some natives drew near, greeting me kindly. They were evidently lovers, talked in low tones, deeply interested in the most trivial things, such as a leaf falling into the sea at our feet and floating stem up like a bowsprit. He probably made some poetic allusion to it, may have proposed braving the seas with her in a scallop as fairy-like, for both fell a-dreaming and were silent for some time, he worshipping her with fascinated eyes, while she, woman-like, pretended to be all unconscious of his admiration. Silently we sat looking over the sea at Maria, just visible in the light of the young moon, like a spirit brooding upon the waters, till I broke the spell by saying "good night," which was repeated in a chorus as I withdrew to my coop, and found my feathered guests had beaten me in the temporary barricade erected in the broken window, entered and made themselves at home during my absence, a fact that scarcely endeared the spot to me. Next morning I was unusually merry. Couldn't tell why, but tried to sing as I made my toilette at the spring. Laughed nearly all the way into town, saying my prayers and blessing God, when I came suddenly upon a horseshoe in the middle of the road. Took it as an omen, and a keepsake. Horseshoes aren't shed everywhere, nor for everybody. I thought it the prophecy of a change, and at once cancelled my engagement with my employer without having set foot into his house farther than the dining-room, or made any apparent impression upon the adamantine bosom of his family. After formally expressing my gratitude to Monsieur for his renewed offers of hospitality, I turned myself into the street, and was once more adrift in the world. For the space of 3 minutes I was wild with joy at the thought of my perfect liberty. Then I grew nervous, began to feel unhappy, nay, even guilty, as though I had thrown up a good thing. Concluded it was rash of me to leave a situation where I got 2 meals and a mattress, with the privilege of washing at my own expense. I am not sure that it wasn't unwise, for I had no dinner that afternoon, And having no bed either, I crept into the veranda of a house to let, and dozed till daybreak. There was but one thing to live for now, namely to see as much of Tahiti as possible, and at my earliest convenience return like the prodigal son to that father who would doubtless feel like killing something appropriate as soon as he saw me coming. I said as much to a couple of Frenchmen, brothers, who are living a dream life over yonder, and whose wildest species of dissipation for the last 7 years has been to rise at intervals from their settees in the arbor, go deliberately to the farther end of the garden, and eat several mangoes in cold blood. To comprehend Tahiti, a man must lose himself in forests whose resinous boughs are knotted with ribbons of sea-grass. There, overcome by the music of sibilant waters sifting through the antlers of the coral, he is supposed to sink upon drifts of orange blossoms, only to be resuscitated by the spray of an approaching shower, crashing through the green solitudes like an army with chariots. So those brothers said, with a mango poised in each hand. And they added that I should have an official document addressed to the best blood in the kingdom, namely 40 chiefs, Tahiti, who would undoubtedly entertain me with true barbarian hospitality, better the world knows not. There was a delay for some reason. I, rather impatient, and scarcely hoping to receive so graceful a compliment from headquarters, trudged on alone with a light purse and an infinitesimal bundle of necessities, caring nothing for the weather nor the number of miles cleared per day, since I laid no plans save the one, to see as much as I might with the best grace possible, keeping an eye on the road for horseshoes. Through leagues of verdure I wandered, feasting my 5 senses and finding life a holiday at last. There were numberless streams to be crossed, where I loafed for hours on the bridges, satisfying myself with sunshine. Not a savage in the land was freer than I. No man could say to me, "Why stand ye here idle?" For I could continue to stand as long as I liked, and as idly as it pleased me, in spite of him. There were bridgeless streams to be forded, but the Tahitian is a nomad continually wandering from one edge of his fruitful world to the other. Moreover, he is the soul of peace towards men of good will. I was invariably picked up by some bare-backed Hercules, who volunteered to take me over the water on his brawny brown shoulders, and could have easily taken 2 like me. It was good to be up there while he strode through the swift current, for I felt that he was perfectly able to carry me to the ends of the earth without stopping, and that sense of reliance helped to reassure my faith in humanity. As I wandered, from most native houses came the invitation to enter and eat. Night after night I found my bed in the corner of some dwelling whither I had been led by the master of it with unaffected grace. It wasn't simply showing me to a spare room, but rather unrolling the best mat and turning everything to my account so long as it pleased me to tarry. Sometimes the sea talked in its sleep not a rod from the house. Frequently the mosquitoes accepted me as a delicacy, and did their best to dispose of me. Once I awoke with a headache, the air was so dense with the odor of orange blossoms. There was frequently a strip of blue bay that ebbed and flowed languidly, and had to be lunched with, or a very deep and melodious spring, asking for an interview, and I may add, it always got it. I remember one miniature castle built in the midst of a grassy Venice by the shore. Its moats, shining with goldfish, were spanned with slender bridges. Toy fences of bamboo enclosed the rarer clumps of foliage, and there was such an air of tranquillity pervading it, I thought I must belong there. Something seemed to say, "Come in." I went in, but left very soon. The place was so fairy-like, I felt as though I were liable to step through it and come out on some other side, and I wasn't anxious for such a change. I ate when I got hungry, a very good sort of a meal, consisting usually of a tiny piglet cooked in the native fashion, swathed in succulent leaves, and laid between hot stones till ready for eating. breadfruit like mashed potato, but a great deal better, orange tea and cocoa milk, surely enough for 2 or 3 francs. Took a sleep whenever sleep came along, resting always till the clouds or a shadow from the mountain covered me so as to keep cool and comfortable. Natives passed me with salutations. A white man now and then went by, barely nodding, or more frequently eyeing me with suspicion, and giving me as much of his dust as he found convenient. In the wider fellowship of nature I forswore all blood relations, and blushed for those representatives of my own color, as I footed it right royally. Therefore I was enabled to scorn the fellow who scorned me, while he flashed the steel hoofs of his charger in my face, and dashed on to the village we were both approaching with the dusk. What a spot it was! A long lane, as green as a spring meadow, lying between wall-like masses of foliage, whose deep arcades were frescoed with blossoms and festooned with vines. It seemed a pathway leading to infinity, for the blood-red bars of sunset glared at its farther end, as though Providence had placed them there to keep out the unregenerated. Not a house visible all this time, nor a human, though I was in the heart of the hamlet. Passing up the turf-cushioned road, I beheld on either hand, through a screen of leaves, a log spanning a rivulet that was softly singing its monody. At the end of each log the summer house of some Tahitian, who sat in his doors smoking complacently. It was a picture of still life, with a suggestion of possible motion, a village to put into a greenhouse, water, and keep fresh forever. Let me picture it once more. One mossy street between 2 babbling brooks, and every house thereof set each in its own moated wilderness. This was Papioli. Like rows of cages full of chirping birds, those bamboo huts were distributed up and down the street. As I walked, I knew something would cause me to turn at the right time and find a new friend ready to receive me, for it always does. So I walked slowly and without hesitation or impatience until I turned and met him coming out of his cage, crossing the rill by his log, and holding out his hand to me in welcome. Back we went together, and I ate and slept there as though it had been arranged 1,000 years ago. Perhaps it was. There was a racket up at the farther end of the lane, by the chief's house, songs and nose-flutings upon the night air, moreover a bonfire, and doubtless much nectar. Too much, as usual, for I heard such cheers as the soul gives when it is careless of consequences, and caught a glimpse of the joys of barbarism, such as even we poor Christians cannot wholly withstand, but turning our backs think we are safe enough. Commend me to him who has known temptation and not shunned it, but actually withstood it. It was the dance, as ever it is the dance, where all the aspirations of the soul find expression in the body. Those bodies that are incarnate souls, or whose souls that are spiritualized bodies, inseparable, whatever they are, for the time being. The fire glowed fervently, bananas hung out their tattered banners like decorations, palms rustled their silver plumes aloft in the moonlight, the sea panted upon its sandy bed in heavy sleep, the night-blooming cereus opened its waxen chambers and gave forth its treasured sweets. Circle after circle of swart, savage faces were turned upon the flame-lit arena, where the dancers posed for a moment with their light drapery gathered about them and held carelessly in one hand. Anon the music chimed forth, a reiteration of chords caught from the bird's treble and the wind's bass. Full and resounding syllables, richly poetical, telling of orgies and of the mysteries of the forbidden revels at the charmed valleys of the gods, hearing which it were impossible not to be wrought to madness, and the dancers thereat went mad, dancing with infinite gesticulation, dancing to whirlwinds of applause, till the undulation of their bodies was serpentine, and at last, in frenzy, they shrieked with joy, threw off their garments, and were naked as the moon. So much for a vision that kept me awake till morning, when I plodded on in the damp grass, and tried to forget it, but couldn't exactly, and never have to this hour. Went on and on over more bridges, spanning still flowing streams of silver, past springs that lay like great crystals framed in moss under dripping, fern-clad cliffs that the sun never reaches. Came at last to a shining whitewashed fort on an eminence that commands the isthmus connecting the two hemispheres of Tahiti, where down I dropped into a narrow valley full of wind and discord and a kind of dreary neglect that made me sick for any other place. More refreshment for the wayfarer, but to be paid for by the dish, and therefore limited. Was obliged to hate a noisy fellow with too much bushy black beard and a freckled nose, and to like another who eyed me kindly over his absinthe, having first mixed a glass for me. A native asked me where I was going. Being unable to give any satisfactory answer, he conducted me to his canoe, about a mile distant, where he cut a sapling for a mast, another for a gaff, twisted in a few moments a cord of its fibrous bark, rigged a sail of his sleeping blanket, and we were shortly wafted onward before a light breeze between the reef and shore. 3 of us, with a bull pup in the bows, dozed under the afternoon sun. He of the paddle awoke now and then to shift sail, beat the sea impetuous for a few seconds, and fall asleep again. Voices roused me occasionally, greetings from colonies of indolent Kanaks on shore, whose business it was to sit there till they got hungry, laughing weariness to scorn. Close upon our larboard bow lay one of the islands that had bewitched me as I paced the shore but a few days previous. Under us the measureless garden of the sea unmasked a myriad imperishable blossoms, centuries old some of them, but as fair and fresh as though born within the hour. All that afternoon we drifted between sea and shore, and beached at sunset in a new land. Footsore and weary, I approached a stable, from which thrice a week stages were dispatched to Papeete. A modern pilgrim finds his scrip cumbersome, if he has any, and deems it more profitable to pay his coachman than his cobbler. I climbed to my seat by the jolly French driver, who was continually chatting with 3 merry nuns sitting just back of us, returning to the convent in Papeete after a vacation retreat among the hills. How they enjoyed the ride, as 3 children might, and were quite wild with delight at meeting a corpulent père, who smiled amiably from his saddle, and offered to show them the interior of the pretty chapel of Faa, 3 A's in that word, the very ones I grew melancholy in when I was a man of business. So they hurled themselves madly from the high seat, one after the other, scorning to touch anything so contaminating as a man's hand, though it looked suicidal, as the driver and I agreed while the 3 were at prayers by the altar. Whipping up over the road townward, I could almost recognize my own footprints left since the time I used to take the dust in my face 3 mornings a week from the wheel of that very vehicle as I footed it in to business. Passing the spring, my toilette of other days, drawing to the edge of the town, we stopped being jolly, and were as proper as befitted travellers. We looked over the wall of the convent garden as we drove up to the gate, and saw the Mother Superior hurrying down to us with a cumbersome chair for the relief of the nuns, but before she reached us they had cast themselves to earth again in the face of destiny, and there was kissing, crying, and commotion, as they withdrew under the gateway like so many doves seeking shelter. When the gate closed after them, I heard them all cooing at once, but the world knows nothing further. "Where would I be dropped?" asked the driver. "In the middle of the street, please you, and take half my little hole for your ride, sir." He took it, dropped me where we stood, and drove away, I pretending to be very much at my ease. God help me, and all poor hypocrites. I sought a place of shelter, or rather retirement, for the air is balm in that country. There was an old house in the middle of a grassy lawn on a by-street. 2 of its rooms were furnished with a few papers and books, and certain gentlemen who contribute to its support lounge in when they have leisure for reading or a chat. I grew to know the place familiarly. I stole a night's lodging on its veranda in the shadow of a passion vine, but for fear of embarrassing some early student in pursuit of knowledge, I passed the second night on the floor of the dilapidated cook-house, where the ants covered me. I endured the tortures of one who bears his body to an unceasing shower of sparks, but I survived. There was in this very cook-house a sink 6 feet in length and as wide as a coffin. The third night I lay like a galvanized corpse with his lid off, till a rat sought to devour me, when I took to the streets and walked till morning. By this time the president of the club, whose acquaintance I had the honour of, tendered me the free use of any portion of the premises that might not be otherwise engaged. With a gleam of hope, I began my explorations. Up a narrow and winding stair I found a spacious loft. It was like a mammoth tent, a solitary centre pole its only ornament. Creeping into it on all fours, I found a fragment of matting, a dry crust, an empty soda bottle, footprints on the sands of time. "Poor soul!" I gasped. "Where did you come from? What did you come for? Whither, oh whither have you flown?" I might have added, "How did you manage to get there?" but the present was so important a consideration, I had no heart to look beyond it. The next 10 nights I passed in the silent and airy apartment of my anonymous predecessor. 10 nights I crossed the unswept floor that threatened at every step to precipitate me into the reading room below. With a faint heart and hollow stomach, I threw myself upon my elbow and strove to sleep. I lay till my heart stopped beating, my joints were wooden, and my 4 limbs corky beyond all hope of reanimation. There the mosquito revelled, and it was a promising place for centipedes. At either end of the building an open window admitted the tip of a banana leaf. Up their green ribs the sprightly mouse careered. I broke the backbones of these banana leaves, though they were the joy of my soul, and would have adorned the choicest conservatory in the land. Day was equally unprofitable to me. My best friends said, "Why not return to California?" Every one I met invited me to leave the country at my earliest convenience. The American consul secured me a passage, to be settled for at home, and my career in that latitude was evidently at an end. In my superfluous confidence in humanity, I had announced myself as a correspondent for the press. It was quite necessary that I should give some plausible reason for making my appearance in Tahiti friendless and poor. Therefore I said plainly, "I am a correspondent, friendless and poor," believing that any one would see truth in the face of it with half an eye. "Prove it," said one who knew more of the world than I. Then flashed upon me the alarming fact that I couldn't prove it, having nothing whatever in my possession referring to it in the slightest degree. It was a fatal mistake that might easily have been avoided, but was too well established to be rectified. In my chagrin I looked to the good old bishop for consolation. Approaching the mission house, through sunlit cloisters of palms, I was greeted most tenderly. I would have gladly taken any amount of holy orders for the privilege of ending my troublous days in the sweet seclusion of the mission house. As it was, I received a blessing, an autograph, and a Godspeed to some other part of creation. Added to this, I learned how the address to the 40 chiefs of Tahiti in behalf of the foreign traveller, my poor self, had been dispatched to me by a special courier, who found me not. And doubtless the fêtes I heard of, and was forever missing, marked the march of that messenger, my proxy, in his triumphal progress. In my innocent degradation it was still necessary to nourish the inner man. There is a market in Papeete, where, under one broad roof, 80 hucksters of both sexes congregate long before daylight, and, while a few candles illumine their wares, patiently await custom. A half-dozen coolies with an eye to business serve hot coffee and chocolate, at a dime per cup to any who choose to ask for it. By 7 a.m. the market is so nearly sold out that only the more plentiful fruits of the country are to be obtained at any price. A prodigal cannot long survive on husks, unless he have coffee to wash them down. I took my cup of it, with 2 spoonfuls of sugar and ants dipped out of a cigar box, and a crust of bread into the bargain, sitting on a bench in the market-place, with a coolie and a Kanak on either side. It was not the coffee nor the sugared ants that I gave my dime for, but rather the privilege of sitting in the midst of men and women who were willing to accept me as a friend and helpmeet without questioning my ancestry, and any one of whom would go me halves in the most disinterested manner. Then there was sure to be some superb fellow close at hand, with a sensuous lip curled under his nostril, a glimpse of which gave me a dime's worth of satisfaction, and more too. Having secreted a French roll, 5 cents, all hot, under my coat, and gathered the bananas that would fall in the yard so seasonably, I made my day as brief and comfortable as possible by filling up with water from time to time. The man who has passed a grimy chop-house, wherein a frowsy fellow sat at his cheap spread, without envying the frowsy fellow his cheap spread, cannot truly sympathize with me. The man who has not felt a great hollow in his stomach, which he found necessary to fill at the first fountain he came to, or go over on his beam ends for lack of ballast, cannot fall upon my neck and call me brother. At daybreak I haunted those street fountains, waiting my turn, while French cooks filled almost fathomless kegs, and coolies filled pot-bellied jars, and Kanaks filled their hollow bamboos that seemed fully a quarter of a mile in length. There I meekly made my toilette, took my first course of breakfast, rinsed out my handkerchiefs and stockings, and went my way. The whole performance was embarrassing, because I was a novice, and a dozen people watched me in curious silence. I had also a boot with a suction in the toe. There is dust in Papeete. While I walked, that boot loaded and discharged itself in a manner that amazed and amused a small mob of little natives who followed me in my free exhibition, advertising my shooting boot gratuitously. I was altogether shabby in my outward appearance, and cannot honestly upbraid any resident of the town for his neglect of me. I know that I suffered the agony of shame and the pangs of hunger, but they were nothing to the utter loneliness I felt as I wandered about with my heart on my sleeve, and never a bite from so much as a daw. Did you ever question the possibility of a man's temporary transformation under certain mental, moral, or physical conditions? There are seasons when he certainly isn't what he was, yet may be more and better than he has been, if you give him time enough. I began to think I had either suffered this transformation, or been maliciously misinformed as to my personality. Was I truly what I represented myself to be, or had I been a living deception all my days? No longer able to identify myself as any one in particular, it occurred to me that it would be well to address a few lines to the gentleman I had been in the habit of calling father, asking for some particulars concerning his absent son. I immediately drew up this document, ready for mailing. Mosquito Hall, Centipede Avenue, Papeete. Dear Sir, a nondescript awaits identification at this office, answers to the names at the foot of this page, believes himself to be your son, to have been your son, or about to be something equally near and dear to you. He can repeat several chapters of the New Testament at the shortest notice, recites most of the Catechism and Commandments, thinks he would recognize 2 sisters and 3 brothers at sight, and know his mother with his eyes shut. He likewise confesses to the usual strawberry mark in fast colors. If you will kindly send by return mail a few dollars, he will clothe, feed, and water himself, and return immediately to those arms which, if his memory does not belie him, have more than once sheltered his unworthy frame. I have, dear sir, the singular fortune to be the article above described. The 6 months which would elapse before I could hope for an answer would probably have found me past all recognition, so I ceased crying to the compassionate bowels of Tom, Dick, and Harry, waiting with haggard patience the departure of the vessel that was to bear me home, with a palpable C.O.D. tacked on to me. Those last hours were brightened by the delicate attentions of a few good souls who learned too late the shocking state of my case. Thanks to them, I slept well thereafter in a real bed, and was sure of dinners that wouldn't rattle in me like a withered kernel in an old nutshell. I had but to walk to the beach, wave my lily hand, heavily tanned about that time, when lo, a boat was immediately dispatched from the plump little corvette Chevrolet, where the tricolor waved triumphantly from sunrise to sunset all the year round. Such capital French dinners as I had there, such offerings of bed and board and boundless sympathy as were made me by those dear fellows who wore the gold lace and had a piratical-looking cabin all to themselves, were enough to wring a heart that had been nearly wrung out in its battle with life in Tahiti. No longer I walked the streets as one smitten with the plague, or resolved in envious circles about the market-place where I could have got my fill for $50, but had neither the one nor the other. No sooner I went at daybreak to swell the procession at the waterspout, or sat on the shore the picture of despair, waiting sunrise, finding it my sole happiness to watch a canoe-load of children drifting out upon the bay, singing like a railful of larks, nor walked solitarily through the night up and down the narrow streets wherein the gendarme had learned to pass me unnoticed, with my hat under my arm, and my heart in my throat. Those delicious moons always seduced me from my natural sleep, and I sauntered through the cocoa groves, whose boughs glistened like row after row of crystals, whose shadows were as mosaics wrought in blocks of silver. I used to nod at the low, whitewashed calabooses, fairly steaming in the sun, wherein Herman Melville got some chapters of Omoo. Over and over again I tracked the ground of that delicious story, saying to the breadfruit trees that had sheltered him, "Shelter me also, and whoever shall follow after, so long as your branches quiver in the wind." O reader of Omoo, think of Motu Otu, actually looking warlike in these sad days, with a row of new cannons around its edge, and pyramids of balls as big as cocoanuts covering its shady centre. Walking alone in those splendid nights, I used to hear a dry, ominous coughing in the huts of the natives. I felt as though I were treading upon the brinks of half-dug graves, and I longed to bring a respite to the doomed race. One windy afternoon we cut our stern hawser in a fair wind and sailed out of the harbor. I felt a sense of relief, and moralized for 5 minutes without stopping. Then I turned away from all listeners, and saw those glorious green peaks growing dim in the distance. The clouds embraced them in their profound secrecy. Like a lovely mirage, Tahiti floated upon the bosom of the sea. Between sea and sky was swallowed up vale, garden, and waterfall, point after point crowded with palms, peak above peak in that eternal crown of beauty, and with them the nation of warriors and lovers, falling like the leaf, but unlike it, with no followers in the new season. End of Chapter 18. End of South Sea Idyls by Charles Warren Stoddard.